So I was talking to my colleague about like what makes someone a good front-end developer. And it sparked a fairly nice argument, or not an argument, but a good discussion about okay, when do you know? Like how do you determine who's a good front-end developer and who's a bad one? And I don't I actually our discussion kind of became more around how like what is a like a good what is a front end developer. So the market or the business usually like the community talks about front end developers as being people who do JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and are more leaning towards the UI part of an application, which is absolutely fair, and it's a fairly good description whatever this is about, right? But what I'm trying to capture here is that if you want to be a good front-end developer, let's start by being a good developer. And what is a good developer? Well, a good developer is somebody who understands the full application. You don't have to know everything, but you need to understand how writing code on the server side works, how writing code on the client side works, and what's good practice in every programming language. Because one thing that what I'm trying to capture here is that there's a large amount of people who believe that just making it work, and I mean this is some senior people, like I can see it all everywhere. They don't do any and especially this is a poison, especially in the front-end community, because it seems that it's almost like you have a bunch of people who think that this movement for test-driven development, it doesn't really apply to the client side. No, nobody really cares about it in JavaScript land, and it's just not true. Like, so many issues I've had with code which is untested and like poorly maintained. I mean, it does a really smooth, really cool animation, and even sometimes a really bad animation, but it gets the job done. And for some reason, that's the way things work in JavaScript land. And I want to be one of those people who start pushing us in a better direction where like I'm trying like this. That's what the discussion was. Like we argued that, or agreed rather, that if you want to be a good front-end developer, start by being a good developer. Like the rules are very simple. Like especially like you've heard me talk about, I don't like that people use lambda functions for absolutely everything. Like start making name functions. Like follow the functional programming patterns, the basics, so that you get testable, maintainable code. And because I've seen people who will they use React Router, and they put I did a code test for this thing, and I was like, the guy who made this, or the girl, I don't know, had this they had added an either monad to this little code test problem, which is this really fancy functional paradigm thing, which is really specific and really complicated. And it's great if you know what you're doing, and it's great if you want to make a really robust pipeline. And it's even but I argue that if you're adding that to a language like JavaScript, you have to be really careful, because that's very few programmers know how to use monads. And if you're adding that just arbitrarily to your code, and I'm wondering why are you doing that? Why are you making things unnecessarily complicated? Because a monad in a few places is not going to give you anything. It has almost no value. You can do that with an if else. And at the same time, when I went to the React Router, there was a React application. The React Router had all these predicates because it was a login based system, and you had to log in before you could go to certain routes on the page. And everything, like all the logic for determining if a user could enter a page, was in an inline function. It was a lambda function. I was like, this is really important logic that determines whether or not a user should get access to a protected piece of data. And you're not testing that. Like, you do a monad to impress me that you can use them, but you're not fixing something as important. Like you're not actually doing what would be more important, which is to like build a really good application. So I'm not trying to bash. I mean, I do a lot of mistakes. I make tons of mistakes, and maybe that's the case here. I'm just trying to capture this idea that you start by being a good developer. Start by like you get to like to be a specialist in front end. You really only have to know the tools, but the tool like the same rules apply. There's nothing unique about being a front end developer. It's the same principles. You just have to know what's good and what's bad. And my general rules, and these are some tips I hope for people who are just starting out. Start, especially this is true especially in JavaScript. Start by creating pure functions. In other words, pure function is a function that doesn't like throw an error, it doesn't like mutate things, it just has an input and returns an output, completely pure. Start by doing that. If you can make everything that you can make a pure named function, because they are very easy to test and they scale extremely well. They're very maintainable. Number two, think about simplicity. Like, think about simplicity. Be very careful about adding complexity. Like, don't make things more complicated than they have to be. When I talk about simplicity, I'm saying that simplicity is the most powerful tool in your toolbox. Don't add like arbitrarily like add tools to your stack or do all these things unless you think that there's a really big benefit to doing so. Think about function libraries. Think about pure, as I said, test-driven development, pure functions. These are really good practices. And a function, remember, simplicity means things such as having a deterministic function. In other words, you don't create super functions that do all kinds of things. Like create very small functions. I mean, the average size of one of my functions is usually between 1 to at the most 30 lines of code, like total max. That's in that range, and that's in my opinion a fairly small function. Finally, the last tip I have is to make sure that, like, think about function libraries and think about the maintainability of your code base long term. Now, nothing in this world is more maintainable, like apart from not having code. Like, the less code you can have, the better, but nothing is more maintainable than a pure function library. In type languages, this would be a class with static functions. Static functions are the most easily the most maintainable thing you can have. So, and these practices, like thinking about simplicity and like making sure, like not just making things work as opposed to making things simple and maintainable. These are the things you should be thinking about. And I think that the reason why some people in JavaScript land don't really get this is because it's easier to get started writing JavaScript code and doing CSS and HTML. I mean, it's not still pretty tricky, but it's easier than going into the server side, and it's a little bit sexier. So a lot of graphic-oriented UX design people want to comes in from like that route, and they don't really have a computer science degree or like a background in server-side programming. And people like me who have that, we have like a bit greater understanding of the whole. So take it on yourself to make sure that you do that, because like just making something work or being really good at making something look very nice, that's just half the puzzle. Because trust me, nobody cares how well and how great your animation looks if it doesn't work, if it's not maintainable, if it crashes if it slows down everybody on the project because nobody can really make it work. So start by make these great animations, like be passionate about it, like make this awesome code, but please make sure that you start by making the code good before you make the product good.